Morning, YouTubers. So today I have a treat for you and for me as well. I'm sure I'm going to learn something. We are going to do a stick rod shootout where we're going to compare all the conventional rods that we have here in North America on 1/4-inch plate, and then we're going to do cut and etches on everything and compare the results and get an idea if, you know, the old lore of welders past is true. Because there's a lot of thoughts on what rods are good for what and what the penetration is, all of that stuff. So we're going to look at all of that today in a gigantic shootout. Let's get into it. All right, guys. Grab a bag of popcorn and a beer or something and settle down, and let's talk about what we got for a setup. I'm going to be welding beads on plate on this 1/4-inch plate. 2 passes with each rod we're going to run, and then we're going to cut the whole thing in half, etch it, and compare penetration between rods. Now for all of this steel here, I'm going to set up as fillet welds, and we're going to do 2 passes, so one on one side, one on the other, on this 1/4-inch steel fillet welds with each rod. We're going to cut them, we're going to etch them, and we're going to look at it. And the purpose of doing this is that there's a lot of what I call old wives' tale or old welders' tales that certain rods are only good for certain things, and there is a lot of truth to that, but how do we as new welders understand or know that other than, hey, this person says this? Well, that's the point of doing testing. We can see firsthand whether or not something works for a particular purpose. So that is the purpose of this. Now, for rods, we are going to be doing 60-13, 70-14, 70-18, 60-10, 60-11, and if I didn't say it already, I probably did 70-24. So we're going to do 6 different rods. When you look at the stick welding amperage calculator, you can see that under all of these, they give a general use. So like 60-13, general use, 70-14, smooth, easy, fast, low hydrogen, strong, smooth, easy, faster. What I kind of found was interesting, one of these, so like general use, oh, and they also give penetration. That was what I found interesting. So they claim that 60-13 is low, 70-14 is medium, 70-18 is low, 70-24 is low. You can see there that the only one that it says is really medium penetrating is 70-14, and it says deep penetrating 60-10. Now, the interesting thing is that if you've been watching my other videos, which if you haven't, you should, I kind of did a lot of stick rod testing, and I found that the penetration of a lot of the rods were actually pretty close to one another. Now, I've never done a cut and etch on 70-14, but I guess we're going to find out today whether or not this holds true. So, quite interesting stuff. Let's just hop right in, not even waste any time. All right, so first up is 60-13, right here. 115 amps we're running. So I'm going to fast forward through the actual welding. There's really no need to show it. This isn't a how to weld guide. My other videos do a great job at that. But yeah, the 60-13 fillet welds, I had a really bad time running them. It's like a piece of the flux would drop off the rod, and then I got real bad slag inclusion on the start, but the cut and etch still turned out all right. All right, enough talking from me. All right, up next is 70-14. I'm going to run these at 120. Got 7024 here, bumped the amperage up to 165 amps. All right, we're gonna do 7018. Running this at 125 amps. All right, it got 6011 at 95 amps. I did turn the arc force up to 60%, where that's what Miller recommends for this rod. Got 6010 here, same amperage as 6011, 95 amps. I won't destroy your ears with any more of that terrible music. I thought I would just say a quick story, and I probably said this one already, but when I was learning to weld, aka I didn't know what I was doing as a kid, a buddy of mine brought a cutlass over to my house, and I needed to weld a shock tower in for it because it ripped off the frame. Well, needless to say, I used a flux core wire welder, welded on this shock tower for like an hour, and then when I was done, I'm not even exaggerating, it just like fell out. So we all start somewhere. Keep welding. All right, well, that was a bunch of welding, got everything welded up. I'm gonna wire wheel and clean all of this stuff up spotless, do the cuts and etches, and then come back and we can talk about the results. Dun, 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 dun. Well, I got all these cut up and etched, and I'll tell you what, it took me a lot longer than I thought it would. I wasted half a night, and well, I didn't waste it. I had fun doing it, so it's awesome. Everything turned out pretty good. There are some things that happened that I didn't expect. So this is definitely going to be interesting, at least for me, hopefully for you as well. So I ran 2 passes with each rod on these plates. The exception was the 7024 rod. I ran this and realized, well, I only had 1 rod left. So I ended up using the other half of the rod for a single pass fillet. Unfortunately, I didn't get 2 of those, but hey, I don't have any more, so there's not much I can do about that, but not a big deal. So yeah, I ran 2 passes on these, and I ran at least 2 passes on all of those, and then I did an additional set of plates where I did a comparison, and that was really interesting to me, and again, unexpected results with that, so I'll save that guy for last. But without any further wasting of time, let's talk about what I found. So let's look at this guy. So here we have 3 different rods. What jumps out at me is the 7014 seems to have pretty limited penetration. Now I ran that around 115 amps. I don't know that if I boosted it up to 130 that it would have made a huge difference. And those rods in particular only claim to run at about 140 max or so. So kind of a little bit surprised at that. Now it could be that I was holding too tight of an arc and that contributed, but whatever it is, what it is there. Now the 6013 beads, pretty limited penetration. I don't really see any more penetration with 7014 despite that Miller calls it a medium penetrating rod. The 7024 clearly has superior penetration and also a very wide weld. Now you have to remember that was run at 165 amps, and you're going to get penetration at that level of heat. So that's not too unexpected. And, you know, out of these, I mean, obviously the 7024 has the best penetration, but for a general purpose rod, honestly, the other two would probably be better, especially because you can't run 7024 uphill. All right, let's go to the next part of it. So here we have the 7018, 6011, 6010. I find it interesting that the 6010 has massively more penetration than the 6011 does, even though they both ran at the same amperage, same dig settings. So clearly that atmosphere of pure CO2 that is created in the 6010 rod really helps with the heat input, and the voltage it operates at is higher, which really drives that penetration in. Now the 7018 bead looks very much like the 6011. Like if you look at those closely, I would almost say the 7018 is maybe a little bit better in part of it, a little bit less, but very comparable. Now I do believe that I could have turned up the amperage on the 6011 quite a bit. Rather than 95, I really should have ran it at like 105, 110, somewhere in there, and it would have performed better. I find that 6011 needs more amperage than 6010, but that's me. Here's a close-up of those two. That's not porosity on it, it's just oil. I wiped the oil to get a little better contrast here. But yeah, I mean, the difference is night and day between those two. And that's why I did a special test, which I'll show at the end of this video, where I upped the amperage on the 6011 to see if it would improve. And we'll find out what happens with that later. So that was pretty interesting on the flat plate. Kind of a little different result than I would have thought, especially with that 7014. But let's see if what happened here carries over to the fillet weld. So let's start out with the 6013. Now, I just want to mention here, I had really bad slag inclusion at the start. So I started the rod here, and immediately it's like flux from the rod like fell off. So I would long arc it, and I just completely got out of control, couldn't do anything about it, snapped out, restarted, and then it ran fine, as you can see, no issues. Upon doing the back side of it, same exact issue. Essentially, once I started a brand new rod, the arc was just doing this, and I had the same problem in another video where the rod just at the start would not settle down. And I think honestly the rods are probably better than 10 years old, and they've just been sitting around in a container, and I think maybe it's just time to throw them out. I mean, I don't really recall 6013 going bad, and it's not like they've just been out exposed to the elements. I mean, they're in I wouldn't call it airtight container, but for some reason, man, the starts on those are rough, and then once you get it going, it welds perfectly fine. So pretty odd with that. So anyways, I did cut it where the weld was solid, and let's take a look at the cut and etch. So the 6013 here, pass 1 is on the right. Now that was on cold plates. You can see that there's not much root fusion. I mean, it got in there a little bit, but not really. The second pass, when the plates were a little bit warm still after I dunked it in the water, is better, but the penetration here is pretty limited. And it's 6013, it's not really known as a deep penetrating rod, so not really anything too unexpected. The welds are pretty much 45 degrees, so I hit that really good. And it's worth noting that the weld size here is actually undersized for 1/4-inch plate. So an additional 2 passes or a weave would have to be put on this to bring it out to where it was a proper size. All right, so that was interesting. Let's look at this guy right here, which I did both 7018 and 7014. So we'll start out with the 7014. Now that's the bottom weld here. You can tell because 7018 always looks the same. No real difference. That's definitely a 7014, a little less ripple pattern. Now these rods, I did have a bad start on one side of the 7014, and you can see here, that was totally my doing. I long arced it at the start and I got flux running in front of the rod. I was able to quick fix it, but after that I ran fine, and then, like I said, this side was perfect, no real issues. The 7018 runs like 7018. Every rod pretty much runs very consistent. So let's take a look at the cut and etch on this. So here we have 7018. Pass 1 is on the right. Now the first pass, second pass, pretty similar. The second pass maybe is a little bit better penetration. You can see that my first pass is a little bit low, so I didn't quite hit the 45-degree angle that I wanted with the weld. And that's pretty common for me with 7018. The way that the bead sinks, it tends to not drip, but slouch down a little bit. Now that little hole gap that's below the plate wasn't machined flat, so you're gonna have that, but you can see the penetration is pretty round and it's in there. I would say it has about the same, if not maybe a little bit more penetration than 6013. Again, 7018 isn't known for great penetration, so this isn't really anything too surprising. One thing I will say that I like about the 7018 rod is that it's very consistent. Like every cut and etch I've ever done so far on this channel shows that the penetration is pretty much the same. It's very reliable, and it has like a nice round profile where you see like near the toes of the weld, even those are penetrated in. It's like a nice round profile. Some of the other rods that you're gonna see don't have that, and they kind of produce a weird or strange, what I would consider a strange penetration profile. But yeah, this is acceptable and nothing out of the ordinary. Like I said in a previous 6013 clip, is that this is not adequate enough for a single pass of that size weld for a 1/4-inch plate, so this would need multiple passes. So the fact that that bead slouched down a little bit isn't really a big deal. You would just run another pass over it and you'd be fine. So now the 7014 is quite an interesting weld here. So according to my little chart, it says that this is a medium penetrating rod, and just by looking at it, I would say that the 7018 honestly is better. Now I did run the 7014 at 115 amps, so maybe I could have cranked it up another 510, but honestly I don't know how much it's going to improve on the penetration end of things. I find it odd that the plate is obviously round on the bottom and you had that little area that wasn't touching the plate, but the fact that it carried over into the weld on pass number 2, where essentially the weld bridged over, and that's exactly what happened, is that it was run in there and it didn't really penetrate much into the sides, didn't penetrate into the root, and it just kind of laid on there. Now the first pass, which surprisingly didn't have preheated plates, actually looks a little bit better, but very little penetration. I would say maybe it'd be worthwhile if I tried this down the road again with 120 or 25 amps. But I know from my experience running this rod in another video that when you start getting over 120, 25 amps, that it tends not to run well. It ends up getting really weird bead appearances and stuff. So I guess my takeaway is 7014 isn't really going to have more penetration than 7018. And if I had to pick between the two, I'd take 7018 all day over 7014. My opinion, of course, but based on this kind of, I guess, reassures me that I'm not making a mistake running 7018. And again, you know, maybe I will do another test and run higher amperage, but I don't like the results of this too much. So now, because I only had one rod of the 7024, I only did one pass on that. And then I did a pass of 60-11 on the other side of that 70-24, and then I did 2 passes of 60-10. So let's take a look at that. You can see here is a 70-24, started down here, corner blew out a little bit, just excessive heat, 165 amps. That really flew in there pretty good. And here is a pass of 60-10 down there. Another pass of 60-10, no real issues. And then here is that pass of 60-11. So overall, that welded pretty good with all 4 rods. Let's, I think it's this guy. Let's take a look at the cut and etch of it. So this is a little bit surprising for me. The 70-24 has real solid penetration through the whole thing. Like, that's about perfect. Now, I say that's surprising to me because 70-24 has a real bad tendency of bridging the root, even at higher amperages. So I don't see any evidence of that here, but that looks good. Now, granted, I was running that at 165 amps, which is, let's be honest, well beyond any of the other rods that I've ran in this video's capability. So it's kind of to be expected that you get something out of it, but that's better than I would have thought. Now, the real shock is the 60-11 pass has virtually no penetration. I find that interesting. I mean, yeah, it's sunk more in the bottom plate, so my rod angle is a bit off. Had I brought it up to where it's more like the 70-24, I don't think it would have made much difference. So I think the reason behind this is pretty simple. I don't run much 60-11, and 60-11 in my experience requires more amperage than 60-10, so I should have been 10 to 15 amps higher than what I was. I ran both 60-11 and 60-10 at 95 amps, and had I boosted it up 105, 110, it would have been a lot better, I think, and I'll actually test that later. Now some interesting results. 60-10, run at 95 amps. You can just see the penetration there, much better than I would say any of the previous rods. The interesting thing is that you can see it's actually undercut into the plate. Now, I normally run this rod at about 90 amps, so I was a little bit higher, but the truth is that my travel speed was just too high. I was moving too fast and not allowing it to deposit metal. So really it's underfill, less so undercut. But yeah, the first pass on the left chewed in there real deep, and then the second pass got even further in there because the plate was a little bit preheated. But yeah, 60-10's no joke, man. If you need to chew away in some thick steel or through scabby material prep, like, that's the way to go. I mean, there's no doubt that that gets in there. I'm actually pretty impressed at that. Now, the undercut lines will be an issue if there's slag in there to get that out. You don't want that in there if you do multiple passes. And this weld is nowhere near the size necessary for 1/4-inch plate, so it would need multiple passes after this initial one. And that would kind of take care of the underfill, undercut issue as well. But yeah, looking real good. Let's move on. So those results are definitely interesting. But the most interesting out of all of them, I think, is this one, to be honest. So what I did is I recognized that my 60-10 passes, I was not feeding enough rod and I was trying to progress too far forward, which led to the undercut that you saw in the pictures. So what I did is, for this, I ran a pass of 60-10 on one side and 60-11 on the other. And for both of them, I just slowed down and let them fill. Now, the 60-10 pass, I ran at 90 amps, which is my preferred amperage, 90 amps. Really crammed the rod in, let it fill. The 60-11 pass, which was the second pass, I actually bumped up to 105 or 110. It might have been 110 amps. And just to see, like, if I could boost the penetration of it to higher than what it was, because I just wasn't happy with the cut and etch, what I saw with the 60-11, a single one. So both passes ran pretty good. Let's take a look at the cut and etch on that. Since I wasn't happy with that 6011, I ended up doing another one here. Now I ran a 6010 first on cold plates, and look at that penetration there, pretty impressive. And you can see it's actually much more than 6011 is. Now the 6011 I ran at 105 amps or 110, I don't remember, but well over 100 amps. And the 6010 I actually turned down to 90. So I find that pretty interesting how much more penetration it has despite lower amperage. So I guess I answered the question, would turning up the 6011 a few amps make a difference? I would say it made a little bit of a difference, but not really a whole lot. And it's in no way, shape, or form close to 6010 as far as overall penetration goes. Now that's interesting to me because my general rule is that 6011 and 6010 are kind of interchangeable, but based on this test result, I gotta say that no, they really aren't interchangeable. I mean, 6011 definitely has penetration, and run hot, it's gonna be as good or better than like 7018 and most other rods, but it's definitely not something I would wanna use as a substitute for 6010. You have to remember too, the 6011 actually had the preheat of the plate to help it, and even that didn't really make that much of a difference. But yeah, it's not to crap on 6011. I actually like the way the rod runs, and I've done enough welding with it recently that I like it. It's just got less penetration than 6010, not the end of the world. And if that's a rod you can run, don't be afraid to run it. Well, let's wrap this video up. All right, guys and girls. I'm about to hit the bed. I've been at this video. It took me about 7 hours to do all of the welding here, cutting, etching, editing. The editing takes longer, far longer than it does to actually shoot the video. And it's like 4 in the morning, maybe even later here, so I'm beat. Now granted, I've been on night shift lately, so I've been going to bed at 5 or 6 a.m. anyway, so not out of the ordinary for me to be up this late. It's just I'm exhausted. So I guess in conclusion, I learned a bunch of stuff. 6010 is awesome. It chews through anything, kind of great rod. I learned that 7014 seems to have very limited penetration, or less than I would have thought. And maybe down the road sometime when I got some free time and feel like doing it over some other video, I might run 7014 at higher amperage and do a couple passes and just see if it's any different at a higher amperage. I mean, I have a hard time believing that 115 amps isn't enough to see some penetration. So I don't know. Who knows on that? If you got any ideas, feel free to leave them in the comments. But yeah, I've learned a lot doing this. Hopefully you did too. If you got any comments, questions, you know where to leave them. Till next time, guys. Thanks.